The house was already sold by the time I landed in Vancouver. I didn't know that yet. I was still standing at baggage claim at YVR, watching the carousel spin, thinking about how I'd surprise my daughter with the smoked salmon I'd packed in my carry-on from Halifax. I'd been gone 11 weeks. A contract job, structural assessment on 3 municipal bridges in Nova Scotia, the kind of work that comes once every few years when you're 62 and most firms would rather hire someone half your age. I took it because we needed the money, because my wife had told me 6 months before that she wanted to renovate the kitchen. I should have paid more attention to what she actually wanted. My phone connected to the airport Wi-Fi, and the messages came in all at once, the way they do after a long flight. Most were junk. One was from my son-in-law, which was strange because he never texted me directly. It said only, "Call me when you land. It's about the house." I stood there with my rolling bag at my feet and read that sentence 4 times. I didn't call him right away. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe there'd been a leak. Maybe the furnace had given out again. It was October, and that old Lennox unit had been threatening to quit for 3 winters. I wheeled my bag outside into the grey Vancouver drizzle and stood under the overhang and told myself there was a reasonable explanation. I called my wife instead. She didn't answer. I called twice more before I got into the cab. Nothing. That was the first time something cold moved through me. Not panic, just a quiet, spreading wrongness, the way you feel when you walk into a room and know immediately that something has been moved. My son-in-law picked up on the first ring. He didn't say hello. He said she listed it 3 weeks ago. It sold conditionally last Tuesday. I only found out yesterday. She told my wife, and my wife told me to stay out of it. I couldn't. I'm sorry. I asked him to repeat what he'd said. He did. The cab driver was talking on his phone in Cantonese. The radio was playing something I didn't recognize. Outside, the highway stretched toward the city under a flat grey sky, and I sat with my carry-on bag between my feet and the smoked salmon in my lap, and I thought, she sold our house while I was working to pay for her kitchen renovation. We'd bought that house in 1991, raised 2 kids in it. My daughter learned to ride a bike in the driveway. My son broke his wrist falling out of the maple tree in the backyard. I'd built the deck myself over 2 summers in the mid-90s, board by board, my father-in-law handing me screws and telling me I was doing it wrong. He wasn't entirely mistaken. 32 years. She sold it in 3 weeks while I was in Halifax measuring bridge decks. I need to back up. Things had been wrong between us for longer than I'd admitted to myself. Looking back now, and I've had a lot of time to look back, I can trace the fraying to about 4 years before all this, when she retired from teaching and I was still working. She'd wanted me to retire too. I was 58. I told her I wasn't ready, that we needed another few years of contributions before I could draw a CPP without penalty, that the pension math just didn't work yet. She said I was choosing work over her. I said I was choosing our financial security over an early retirement we couldn't actually afford. We were both right, partly. That's the thing about long marriages. The fights are never simple. But somewhere in those 4 years, she stopped talking to me about what she wanted and started talking to someone else instead. I don't know exactly when it started. I know it was someone she'd met through a watercolor class she'd joined the year she retired. I know because my daughter told me after everything fell apart that her mother had mentioned him occasionally over the years, casually, just a friend from the class, just as someone who understood the particular loneliness of being married to a man who was always somewhere else. I was in Halifax. She listed the house. The realtor she used was his cousin. The cab dropped me at a house that was no longer mine to enter freely. Technically, I still had keys. Technically, nothing had transferred yet. The conditions hadn't been removed. There were still a few weeks left in the process. But when I walked through the front door, the feeling hit me immediately. Things were gone. Not everything, not even most things, but the things that were hers. The painting she'd bought in Tofino the summer my son graduated high school. The cedar box her mother had given her. The photo albums from before the kids were born. Those were gone. Her closet was half empty in a way that looked deliberate. like she'd been moving things out slowly, over weeks, so I would notice the accumulation. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table we'd eaten 30 years of breakfasts at. I sat there in my coat with my carry-on bag at my feet and the smoked salmon still in my hand, and I didn't move for a long time. My daughter called at 7. She'd known for 2 days. She told me that in the first minute before I could ask, and I could hear how much it had cost her to wait. She's like me that way. She holds things until she can't anymore, and then it comes out all at once. She was crying before she finished her first sentence. I told her to take a breath. She said, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I kept thinking she would tell you herself. I kept thinking there had to be something I was missing." I asked her where her mother was. A pause, long enough that I knew the answer was going to be complicated. "She's in Kelowna," my daughter said. "She's been there for most of the past 3 weeks. She's staying with him. His name is—" and then she stopped, and I said, "I don't need his name," and she said, "Okay." Kelowna, 4 hours east. She'd been in Kelowna for most of the 3 weeks I'd been working 12-hour days on the bridges in Halifax. I thanked my daughter for telling me. I told her I loved her. I told her none of this was her fault, and I meant it completely. Then I hung up and looked at the kitchen she'd wanted to renovate and thought about the 11 weeks of per diem I'd saved and the bridge assessment fee and what all of it added up to. And I thought about the joint account. I checked it at 7:42 that evening. The balance was $4,200. There should have been closer to $38,000. That was what I'd been depositing my per diems into, what we used for household expenses, what we'd agreed to keep liquid for the renovation planning. She'd been withdrawing in amounts just under $3,000, the threshold for automatic bank notification, since early September. 16 separate transactions over 6 weeks. I sat with that number for a while. Then I did what my son-in-law had urged me to do in his text. I called a lawyer. Her name was Beverly Park, and she came recommended by a colleague who'd gone through a divorce 3 years earlier. I reached her voicemail that night, and she called back the next morning at 8, before I'd even made coffee. She asked me to describe the situation. I described it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do not touch the joint account. Do not move money. Do not sell anything. Do not communicate with your wife about finances directly. Can you be in my office this afternoon?" I could. What Beverly explained to me over the next 2 hours was this. In British Columbia, the Family Law Act treats most property acquired during a marriage as family property, divisible on separation. The house, even if she had listed it and accepted a conditional offer, could not be finalized without my signature on the transfer documents. She had either not known this or had been hoping to move fast enough that I wouldn't be back in time to respond. She had also, Beverly told me, potentially exposed herself to a claim of dissipation of family assets through the account withdrawals. That was the legal framing. What it meant in plain English was, she'd taken money that was partly mine, and there was a record of every transaction. I asked what I needed to do. Beverly said, "First, we file a certificate of pending litigation against the property. That freezes the sale. Second, we send a formal notice of separation. Third, and I want you to hear this clearly, you stop answering her calls." She had called 4 times by then. I put my phone face down on Beverly's desk and left it there. She called from a block number 2 days later. I answered without thinking, old habit. 62 years of answering block numbers because they might be important. She said my name in a voice I recognized from 30 years ago, soft and careful, the voice she used when she knew she'd done something wrong. I didn't hang up. I should have. Beverly had told me not to engage. But there's something about a voice you've known for 3 decades. It moves through you differently than words on paper. She said she hadn't meant for it to happen this way. I said, "Which part?" A pause. She said the house had felt like a trap for years. She said she'd been unhappy longer than I knew. She said she hadn't known how to talk to me about it, that every time she tried I was either distracted or defensive or already thinking about the next job. Some of that was probably true. I sat with it. Then I said, You emptied the account while I was working in Halifax. You listed the house without telling me. You were in Kelowna for 3 weeks while I thought you were home. Which of those things do you want to talk to me about?" She didn't answer. I said, "Please speak to my lawyer," and I ended the call. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons in Burnaby for probably 20 minutes after that. Not crying exactly, but not entirely steady either. There's a kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It just settles into your chest quietly like snow, and you don't realize how much has accumulated until you try to move. The conditional sale fell through. When Beverly filed the certificate of pending litigation, the buyer's lawyer flagged the issue immediately. They had a young family and no appetite for a contested title. They walked away within a week, and the deposit was tied up in the uncertainty. The realtor, his cousin, sent a letter suggesting the listing could be relaunched once the family matter was resolved. Beverly sent a response that used the words conflict of interest and professional conduct review in close succession. We didn't hear from the realtor again. My wife, I still thought of her that way, probably always will. The word doesn't just go away after 30 years, retained her own lawyer in Kelowna. Things move the way divorces move, slowly and expensively, and with a particular kind of grey bureaucratic sadness that has nothing to do with the life you actually lived. The financial disclosure process was where things got complicated. She had, it turned out, opened a separate account at a different institution in August, 6 weeks before I left for Halifax. She'd been moving money into it gradually, not just from the joint account but from a TFSA we'd been contributing to jointly since 2009. Beverly put a forensic accountant on it. The total she'd moved was just under $67,000 when you included both accounts. I want to be careful here about how I tell this part because I know how it sounds and I don't want to make it into something it wasn't. She wasn't a villain in a story. She was a person who had been unhappy for a long time and had made a series of decisions that I think she believed were survival and I experienced as betrayal. Both things can be true. What was also true was that $67,000 was money we had both worked for, and some of it was money I had specifically earned in the 11 weeks I was away, deposited faithfully into accounts I thought were ours. The forensic accountant's report was 64 pages. Beverly summarized it in about 12 minutes. The summary was that we had a solid claim. My daughter drove up from Surrey on a Friday evening in November, 3 weeks after I'd come home from Halifax, and found me eating cereal for dinner at the kitchen table. She didn't say anything about the cereal. She just sat down across from me and poured herself a cup of the coffee I'd made 4 hours earlier and forgotten. She asked how I was. I said I was fine. She looked at me the way she's looked at me since she was about 7 years old, when she figured out that I wasn't always being straight with her. "Dad." "I'm getting through it," I said. "That's an honest answer." She nodded. We sat with that for a while. Then she said, "I need to tell you something about Grandma. My mother-in-law, 81 years old, lives in a seniors community in Coquitlam. We'd always been close, she and I. Closer, honestly, than she and her daughter sometimes. She'd called me every few weeks for years just to check in, to hear how the work was going, to ask about my knees. She had known. Not everything, but she'd known her daughter was unhappy, had known there was someone in Kelowna, had known the house was being listed. My daughter had found this out from her aunt, who had heard it from her own mother. The grandmother had not told me. She had not warned me. She had chosen her daughter, which was perhaps what a mother does, but it had cost me the chance to come home and talk to my wife before she'd moved too far into a plan to turn back. I sat with that too. "I'm not angry at her," I said, which was mostly true. She's 81 and she was protecting her child. I understand it. My daughter said, "You're allowed to be a little angry." "Maybe later," I said. We finished the coffee. She made me eat toast. The divorce was finalized in the spring. Under BC's Family Law Act, the matrimonial home is family property regardless of whose name the mortgage is in. We had paid it off in 2019. The assessed value at separation was $1.4 million. Not unusual for a house in the Vancouver area in 2024, though it would have been unimaginable when we bought it in 1991 for $187,000. She was entitled to half. I was entitled to half. That was the law. What was negotiated, and this is where the forensic accountant's report mattered, was the credit against her share for the dissipated assets. The $67,000 she had moved came off her portion. The legal costs came off both portions, which was painful. But at the end of the calculation, I walked away with slightly more than half of the net proceeds, which I put into a GIC at Arbors Sea while I figured out what to do next. I also kept the deck, which sounds like a small thing, but I'd built it with my own hands over 2 summers, and it was coming with me. I bought a smaller place in Langley, detached with a yard, because I'm not ready for a condo, and I don't think I ever will be. The backyard is nothing special yet, just lawn and a couple of old apple trees, but I'd been out there most weekends since I moved in, building a new deck. Nothing fancy, just pressure-treated lumber and some cedar trim. My son came out 2 weekends ago and handed me screws and told me I was doing it wrong. He wasn't entirely mistaken. I've been asked by people who know what happened whether I'm bitter. It's a reasonable question. I think people expect either yes or no, but the real answer is somewhere more complicated. I am 63 years old. I gave 32 years to a marriage that ended while I was working in another province, and I found out about it in a cab at the airport. And the house I built a deck on with my father-in-law's help was nearly sold out from under me while I was measuring bridge clearances in Nova Scotia. Some bitterness is probably warranted. But what I found in the months since is that the bitterness is less loud than I expected. What's louder is something simpler, relief, which surprises me every time I notice it. Relief that I don't have to keep having the same argument about retirement. Relief that the house is smaller and easier to manage. Relief that when I want to spend a Saturday morning drinking coffee and reading on the back deck, there's no one waiting for me to be something I'm not. My daughter calls every Sunday. My son comes out most weekends to either help with the deck or supervise me badly. My mother-in-law called in February, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, about the weather in Coquitlam and whether the Canucks had any real hope this season, and the particular way the light looks on the mountains in late winter. We didn't talk about her daughter. I don't think we needed to. There's a moment in the evening when the light comes across the backyard a certain way and the apple trees catch it. When I think about the house in East Van and the 32 years in the life that happened there, I don't push the thought away. I just let it be there alongside everything else, alongside the smaller mortgage and the unfinished deck and the new GIC and my son's voice calling from the backyard that I'm holding the drill wrong. It all stays. I'm still here. I've thought a lot about the cab ride from YVR, how I was holding smoked salmon in my lap, how the city looked exactly the same as when I'd left it 11 weeks earlier, and how nothing actually was. When I look back at what happened, not with bitterness, just with the kind of clear-eyed honesty that takes a while to arrive, I think the hardest part wasn't the house or the money. It was the realization that I had been paying close attention to the wrong things for years. I knew the load-bearing capacity of 3 municipal bridges in Nova Scotia down to the decimal. I did not know my own marriage was being quietly packed into boxes while I was gone. That's not entirely self-blame, but it's not nothing either. What I've come to believe, sitting on the unfinished deck in Langley on weekend mornings, is that the way a person responds when the ground shifts underneath them tells you more about who they are than anything that happens when life is going smoothly. I didn't rage. I didn't beg. I called a lawyer. I stopped answering calls I shouldn't have answered, and I let the process work the way it was designed to work. Not because I'm especially calm by nature. I'm not, but because somewhere in those first 72 hours, I made a decision to keep my head while everything around me was asking me to lose it. That kind of steadiness, I think, is something you have to practice before you need it. You build it the same way you build a deck, slowly, one board at a time, long before the storm season comes. There's also the matter of what I knew and didn't know. Beverly, my lawyer, said something in our second meeting that stayed with me. She said the people who get through this the fastest are the ones who understand the difference between what they feel and what they can prove. I felt betrayed. What I could prove was a forensic paper trail 64 pages long. Keeping those two things separate, not letting the fury cloud the facts, that's what made the difference between a fair outcome and a devastating one. It's a kind of discipline that has nothing to do with not caring. It has everything to do with caring enough to think straight. And then there's the question of what you do after the signatures, after the GIC, after the first night alone in a house that is smaller and quieter than the one you lived in for 32 years. My son comes out most weekends. My daughter calls on Sundays. My mother-in-law and I still talk about the Canucks. Life doesn't end because a chapter does. That sounds obvious until you're sitting at a kitchen table eating cereal at 7 in the evening, and then it's not obvious at all. It's something you have to choose to believe and keep choosing until it becomes true. The apple trees in my backyard are going to need pruning in the spring. I've been reading up on it. Apparently, if you do it right, they produce better fruit the following year. There's something in that I keep coming back to. I'm still here. The deck's almost done.